So the variable types that we have now, we have values such as like integers and floats and strings and booleans. And with each of these, we could insert a single value into that variable to store and keep track of one single value. Now, what we want to ask now is what happens when we want to keep track of multiple values inside of the same variable? For instance, maybe I have like profits for each of the months of the year. So there's 12 values for the profits, and I want to be able to store those inside of my application. To have 12 variables would be very hard to keep track of, and it would be rather inefficient in terms of storage space to have to keep track of all of them separately. So for these sorts of situations, we can use things known as lists in Python. List will allow us to store multiple values inside of the same variable name so that we can essentially reference them all in one location to make it easier to understand where the values are and where they can be accessed from, right? So to give you an example of this, we'll discuss that exact idea of having like profits maybe like on a quarterly basis. We'll do like 4 months worth of profits. So if I want to create a list, I'm just going to type in the name of the variable and I'm going to set it equal to this empty square brackets. So this is essentially defining profits as an empty list. So now we have a list that's ready for values to be inserted into it. Now, when we insert values into the list, we can sort of just like append them onto the end of the list typically. And when we do that, we'll be able to populate the list. And then from there, if we ever want to reference values inside of the list, we can reference them based off the index of their location in the list. So just to sort of make that a bit more clear, if I have a list of 4 values, say like 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's going to look something like this. What happens is the value 1 is sitting at the front of the list. This is what we refer to as index 0. In programming, we typically start counting at 0 instead of 1. So this is something to sort of get familiar with and start to get used to. So at index 0 will be the first value in the list. This value will be at index 1. This one will be at index 2. And this one will be at index 3. So that's the way that we would be able to access these values, is by looking at their index locations. So let's do a quick little example here. If I want to add a value to the list, I could do profits.append, and then I can append the value to the end of the list. So let me go ahead and add 4 values into our list. I'll go ahead and append 200, and we'll just append 300, and we'll append 400. Okay, so now, if I want to be able to access a value inside of the list, I simply need to reference its location in the list. So for example, if I want to print the first value in the list, what I would do is I would say print profits, and then in square brackets, I put the index that I want to reference. So this would get the profits at index 0, right? And the value at index 0 would be 100. So let's go ahead and run this and see how that works. As you can see, it prints out the value 100 to us. So it takes the value that's in the first position in the list. In this case, it would be the first thing that's inserted, which is 100, and prints it back out to us. And again, I could do profits at 1, for instance, and that would give me the next value, which would be 200. And then if I want to print all of these, there's a few different ways that I can do that. Obviously, I can have 4 print statements, but that's not really overly effective. So if we take from the lessons that we learned before with while loops, we can actually loop through the whole list to be able to take a look at the values. And furthermore, when we discuss for loops, we'll be able to see how we can use for loops to easily iterate this list as well. But we'll stick with while loops right now, and I'll demonstrate how you can use a while loop to iterate this list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up an I value, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. I is going to keep track of where we are in the list currently. So I'm going to start at 0, which would be the beginning of the list. And then what I'm going to say is I'm going to say while I is less than the length, len, of profits. So just to explain this, len is a special function known as length. What it does is it tells you the length of this array or list that we're working with. So in this case, the length of profits is going to be how many values are currently inserted inside of it. So there's 4 values that are inserted inside of it. But remember, we start counting at 0, right? So the last value is at index 3. So essentially length will return to us the last value or the last index available inside of the list. So in this case, that would be 3. So while I is less than the length of the profits, we can go ahead and print out profits at I, right? So this would be an example of how we can print out all of the values inside of the list. And you can see that, apologies. Of course, we would have to increment I after we print it. So we shouldn't forget to do that. As you can see, if I don't do that, it will start to loop infinitely since I never changes. So we need to increment I so that it actually changes. And as you can see here now, it prints out all of the values inside of the list. So this gives you a bit of an intuition behind how these lists actually work. And of course, this gives a bit more of an application towards loops to understand why loops are something that's important. When we have lists of values, being able to manipulate them all is a lot easier utilizing loops than it is to manipulate them all one by one. So there's a few other different things that you can do with these lists. This length function is very helpful. I'll go ahead and just type in profit dot. When you do this, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different functions that exist inside of the lists. I'm not going to go over every single one of them, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an intuition behind some of the more commonly used ones. There are some like insert, for instance. What insert will do is rather than appending a value to the end of the list, we can instead insert it at a specific index. So if I insert at index 0, for instance, it will insert things at the front of the list. So this is a good way of being able to insert at a specific location if you don't want to insert at the end of the list every time. Pop is another special type of list function that will allow you to remove the first value in the list and return it back. So essentially this will remove the first value and then return it back as the return type. So when the value gets returned to you, you'll be able to get that first value, but it also removes it from the list. And then there's also the remove function, which will allow you to remove a specific value. So you can search for a specific value and remove it from the list. And then there are other ones here, like you can sort the list, you can reverse the list. And these are all, again, very commonly used. And they're just different ways of manipulating through these lists. But the main things that you really want to understand is how to insert values and how to delete values, for instance. So you do profits.append to insert the values, profits.remove to remove the values. So those are a few different ones that are relatively helpful for us. One other thing that I will note about lists is that when we deal with things like strings of text, so for instance, when I had like text equals hello, text is actually treated as a list in Python. So what happens is every single one of these letters is an entry inside of the list, and Python sort of treats it as like a coherent string, but in the background, everything is really just like a list of letters. So that hello actually looks like something like this, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that you can work with text in strings in the same way that you can work with the lists that I've been showing so far here, is that you can manipulate them to say, print at a specific index, for instance. You can do that with strings as well. So one other thing when we talk about the idea of index is that we can actually reference like ranges of values as well using the indexes. So I'll give you an example of that. Let me just remove this and say, when we're doing print profits at 0, for instance, you remember that this will print the first value inside of the list. What we can do is we can actually specify a range of values. So I can say 0:1, for instance. And what this will do is it will print we'll print everything from 0 up to 1, but not including 1. If I change this to 2, it'll print everything from 0 to 2, not including 2. So you see it will print the first 2 values of the list. If you do 1 to 2, for instance, this would print, I believe, just the second value of the list. Yeah. And then if you do 1 to 3, for instance, it will print the second and third value of the list. So this is known as, I believe it's called list slicing or splitting. And what it does is essentially it grabs all the values between the two ranges that you specify. So it'll grab everything from the start point to the end point. So you see this one grabs everything that is from 1 to 3. It includes the 1 and 2, but it doesn't include the 3. So just remember, it doesn't include the endpoint. So it stops 1 before the endpoint and includes the beginning point. So that's sort of the way to think about that. So this grabs everything from index 1 to 3, not including index 3. One other thing that I'll note is that if you don't provide an ending index, it will assume that you want to go to the end of the list. So you see that this takes 200, 300, and 400. It takes everything except for the first element, right? Starts at the second element, which is element 1, and goes to the end of the list. And I believe similarly, if you don't include the first part, it will assume that you're starting at the beginning of the list. So you'll see that that cuts it starting at the beginning. So it goes from the beginning up to the second element. Again, we don't include the second element. So it gets index 0 and 1, right? And then one final thing, you can reference starting on the right-hand side as well. So if you recall, when we put in something like 1, it references the second value in the list, which is 200. If I put in -1, it will actually reference the rightmost value in the list, which is 400. So that's another thing to keep in mind with these lists, is that we can reference from right to left instead of left to right. We simply just change it to a negative instead of a positive. So this gives you a good overarching view of what lists are and how they're generally used inside of Python. So this gives you some good examples of some of the things that might be valuable to work with in terms of lists and how they generally work inside of Python.